Welcome, everyone. We're really glad to have you with us here tonight. We're expecting a very good turnout, so thank you in advance for that. And as Rachel said, I'm Darla Seidels, and I'm the superintendent of Rocky Mountain National Park. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Rachel. So the purpose of tonight's session is really to focus on Rocky Mountain National Park's long-range planning effort. And as many of you know, we've been working on this for quite some time. And this is a really critical stage of public engagement process. So the purpose of today's meetings is to give you some ideas about what we're thinking long range. And we really are looking forward to hearing your thoughts and your input and questions about these ideas. So you may wonder why the park needs a visitor use management plan. Well, we've seen a pretty steady rapid rise in visitation since 2012. Between 2012 and 2019, we saw about a 44% increase in visitation. And 2019 was a record year for the park. We had 4.6 million people. And even after implementing the timed entry permit system in 2021, we saw our second heaviest or highest visitation with 4.4 million people. So go ahead and go to the next slide. As you'll hear in a few minutes, this increase has definitely had some impacts, both to the park and to visitors, communities, to the staff. So the intent of this long-range plan really is to help ensure that we're protecting the park resources, that we are providing the best experience possible that we can for our visitors, that we are improving our staff and our visitor safety, and that we are being commensurate with our operational capacity. So with that, let's get into this. We've got several speakers tonight. And again, I'm Darla. We've also got Kyle Patterson. She is the park's public information officer. We've got John Hannon. He is our visitor use management specialist. And Rachel Collins, who you've seen and heard already. She is the park's project manager out of the Denver Service Center, which serves the entire National Park Service. So now I am going to turn it back over to Rachel, and she will talk a little bit about the meeting agenda and logistics. So take it away, Rachel.
Thanks, Darla. She noted my name is Rachel, so you can put a face with a name, and I'm the project manager for the project, serving on behalf of the Park Service out of our Denver office. Do want to do a couple logistical things before we dive into the heart of the presentation. We have a couple sections of this presentation lined up, so just so you know what to expect. We're going to do a little bit of introduction to the park. I know some folks probably know the park really well, or they're getting oriented to the park, so do a little bit of background on the park. We're also going to talk about background on the plan. How did we get here? What are we learning up to this point that brought us to this space? And Kyle's going to cover those parts for us. We're going to then turn it over to John. He's going to walk us through some of the ideas that we're considering, potential strategies, things that we're considering, and how we think about what a quality solution looks like. And then we'll spend the back half of the presentation talking about what this public comment period is about, what to expect from that, how you can participate, and then we'll leave the bulk of the time for the Q&A. Wanted to give people just a heads up that we do have about 30 slides. So we're expecting about kind of a 30 minutes worth of presentation for y'all, if that helps you kind of pace your evening. And then we'll go to the Q&A. Another just quick note on logistics for those who are looking for the Q&A box to answer questions. It is up there in the corner and shown on the screen of where you can find that. If you have a question throughout the presentation, and don't want to forget it, feel free to go ahead and just drop it right in there. We're going to be collecting questions throughout the presentation, kind of organizing them by topic as we go. So don't feel like you've got to wait. Go ahead and drop it in when you have that question, and then we'll come back to them as we go throughout the presentation. Also, for folks who are getting oriented to Teams Live, the button to adjust sound there is down there on the corner of your screen. And if you need captioning service, there is closed captioning within the meeting itself. And there's there in multiple languages. If live captioning is a service that is helpful for you, there is a link in the chat or the announcements feature right there to offer live captioning service. So that's the end of logistics. Let's dive into the heart of the presentation and I will go ahead and turn it over to Kyle to walk us through some background on the park and the process.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us this evening. We really appreciate your engagement and your interest in showing up tonight. So thank you again so much. Next slide, please. We wanted to just remind us all of some of the very important acts that support and protect Rocky Mountain National Park. Again, because you are here, you probably are very familiar with the National Park Service's overall mission tied to the Organic Act. So really, it's that balancing act that we all focus on every day with our efforts at Rocky Mountain National Park to conserve park resources, but also to make sure that we're providing for their use and enjoyment, and not only thinking about all of us right now, but for those that come behind us and for future generations. We also are 95% of a designated wilderness, which provides an extra added layer of protection for us, which really, again, life isn't trammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor and woman and others who do not remain. So again, those are our really main acts that we work for through our planning efforts. Next slide, please. So again, as Rachel mentioned, many of you are very familiar with Rocky Mountain National Park. So we'll just take a moment just to remind you all of Rocky Mountain National Park straddles the Continental Divide. We have the gateway communities of Grand Lake to the west and Estes Park to the east. And one of the main reasons that Rocky Mountain National Park was set aside now over 107 years ago was to protect the fragile ecosystem of the tundra. And so about 1/3 of Rocky is tundra. It is an amazing national park that provides recreational opportunities, solid and scenic beauty, and watchable wildlife. This, again, plan is focused on our day use at Rocky Mountain National Park. Next slide, please. So we wanted to provide a little bit more of our plan background and just, again, to share with you a little bit more information of why we got to this point, as Darla also referenced. Darla focused on some of the areas that this plan will address. We just wanted to highlight those again, and we call those basically our 4 tenets at Rocky Mountain National Park. So it's really looking at our resource protection, including natural and cultural resources, the overall visitor experience, visitor and staff safety concerns, as well as that operational capacity that Darla mentioned. How is visitation increasing our affecting our operational capacity, both staffing and infrastructure? Next slide, please. I also wanted just to share a brief chronological list of some of the day use visitor access strategies that have already taken place at Rocky Mountain National Park. So overall, the National Park Service works on managed access strategies and has for decades. So we just want to remind folks that in 1978, we did start a shuttle bus system in the Bear Lake Road corridor, and that became more modern in the 2000s. And just a little bit more of dates and years on when we have incorporated other management strategies. Next slide, please. We'll go into a little depth here. And again, many of you are aware of some of the access strategy pilots that we have incorporated since 2016. So again, as Darla mentioned, we started seeing this increase in visitation from 2012 to 2019 of 44%. And so we really started to focus our efforts in those high congested areas like the Bear Lake Road corridor, Alpine Visitor Center, and Wild Basin Road. So 2016 through 2019, it was a very reactive stance when those areas became highly congested and there were significant impacts. We started closing those areas and turning visitors around. As we moved through the years of doing that, we saw that we needed to do those more days. So in 2019, basically every day in July, all weekends, June through September, we were turning people around at Bear Lake Road, Wild Basin, and elsewhere. We also have done parking management with delineators to try to avoid illegal parking and resource impacts, and then ongoing education and enforcement. Those were all really important steps, but we also realized that we needed to look holistically because we were pushing use in other areas when we really focused on those highly congested areas. Many of you are aware we did timed entry permit systems, which we call TEPs. In 2020 through 2022, they looked a little different, But again, we looked at the park holistically and then also broke down Bear Lake Road Corridor in 2021 and 2022 as a separate timed entry permit system. Next slide, please. We also just wanted to share with you the overall visitor use management framework. So one of our goals for this planning process is to develop a comprehensive strategy for how to manage day use going forward. To do this, we're using the Visitor Use Management, or VUM, framework that you see on the slide from the Interagency Visitor Use Management Council. This VUM framework is shared by all 6 federal land and water management agencies. You'll see all their logos there on the slide, and is the framework the National Parks uses for guiding us through VUM decisions. So we also want to make sure it helps us identify and share what we're managing for with desired conditions, how we'll know when we've achieved or departed from these conditions, and the amounts and types of use an area can accommodate while still meeting those conditions. Next slide, please. Some of you may be involved or were involved in May of 2021 when we reached out to the public to say what really issues most interfere with your desired park experiences. And again, these photos just highlight some of the things that we heard from you. You can see those for yourself, and if you were engaged in our 2021 pre-NEPA, you probably shared with us some of these same comments. Next slide, please. We also ask, how can the park better protect resources for future generations? And you'll see that there's often overlap for some of these questions. For instance, the timed entry permit reservation system, you'll see through all of these different questions that we ask. It's really important for the public. They see the park area closures and temporary vehicle restrictions. They want us to have more staffing and volunteers and continue the education and enforcement. Next slide, please. We also ask, what is the park doing well to manage these issues that you would like to see continue? And you see the 3 main areas that people indicated that they would like for us to continue. So you'll see the timed entry reservation system on all 3 of these slides, which again continues to emphasize the complexity of the issues that we're facing. Some people feel that it's a deterrent. Other people feel that it helps us manage these issues. And we'll talk about that a little further. Next slide, please. I'll now pass it off to John to talk about some of the potential strategies.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for letting us have the opportunity to kind of share some of these ideas with you. You know, what we're looking for here tonight is just to be able to kind of present the ideas in a more of an overview level, and encourage you to go to the park's website and read the information that we put there. It's much more in depth than what you're going to see here tonight. Tonight, we're hoping just to kind of whet your appetite a little bit and let you dive in deeper for these ideas. The other thing I want to mention before we get into them is, you know, you don't have to take the idea on its face value. You can pull elements that you like from each of the ideas and tell us about that, or tell us elements that you don't like or don't think is appropriate for the park to use. So you don't have to just take it on face value for each idea standalone. You get to kind of pick and choose a little bit, because basically the bottom line is we want to hear from you, and you want to have you help us and be part of the process. So before we get to the ideas, I did want to take a moment and kind of just share what we feel what makes a good idea, what makes a good strategy for the park. And what we're looking for is that sweet spot there, right in the middle between effective, feasible, and desirable. Let me take a moment and kind of give you a little bit of definition on how we see each of those. So an effective strategy is one that'll help us resolve key issues within the park. The other thing is, you know, how would this strategy help us meet project goals? Feasibility, how much is this strategy going to cost? And the potential sources of funding that, you know, we might be able to utilize to do that, whether it be user fees, appropriated fees. The other thing is, which resources need to be implemented in this strategy, or excuse me, which resources will be needed to implement the strategy. And that could be, you know, technology, staffing, all of the above. And then desirability, when and where this strategy would be most useful. How much would this strategy improve visitors' experience? and/or resource conditions in the park, and whether there are likely to be trade-offs, trip planning, or wait times to access the park. So let's take a look at the first idea. So we'll start off with kind of the most easy idea to explain. If you've visited the park in the last couple of years, you've experienced the park's timed entry system if you came during the summer season. And so that's kind of the first idea we have. We feel that the timed entry system as it currently is working to a certain degree. And so that's the first idea. So when you're looking at this idea, think about, the timed entry system from the 22 season. Again, that incorporates advanced reservations, 2-hour arrival windows, really trying to spread that use throughout the park, or excuse me, throughout the day, and with the 2 types of reservations, trying to spread that use throughout the park. And of course, you notice on the right-hand side of the slide, there's benefits and trade-offs, like everything in all of these ideas. One of the benefits is that, we're able to spread the use effectively throughout the park. You're able to find parking more readily, move about the park a little better. But, the trade-off there is this does require a little bit of advanced planning on your visit to the park. Let's take a look at the second idea. So sticking with the reservation theme, this would be just kind of another play on the reservations there, where we would have, again, timed entry reservations, but they would be tied to a particular entrance station. You'd enter through a particular entrance station, be it the Beaver Meadows entrance station on the east side of the park or the Grand Lake entrance on the west side of the park, and you would pick that as part of your reservation. In this idea, we're not doing reservations along the Bear Lake Road corridor, but instead, if you're familiar with Bear Lake Road, the upper portion, that would be the portion above the intersection between Park and Ride and Glacier Basin Campground, would be closed probably during the peak hours of the midday to private vehicles, and it would be shuttle bus only at that time. The other thing you'll notice with this strategy and all the other ones is commercial users or commercial operators would probably be subject to these reservation systems. Currently, under the pilot timed entry systems, they're exempt from that, but moving forward, we need to roll those commercial groups into the fold as well. Let's take a look at idea 3. So this would be, again, another variation on the reservations theme, but at this time, this would be daily reservations. So the timed portion of reservations would go away. The trade-offs there would be visitors would be able to come anytime they choose during the day that they had a reservation for. But most likely one of the trade-offs would be that we'd probably have to have a lower number of reservations available overall, because our typical visitation pattern, it has most visitors coming between 10 and 2. And again, common to all these reservations, you'd need advanced planning, make your reservations ahead of time, and but there would be no length of stay period for your visit during the day. Let's take a look at idea 4. So idea 4 moves away from the reservation idea and is based on metering or temporary delays at the park entrance stations. What that would be, if you had visited the park between 2016 and 2019 during the summer, you might have experienced a Bear Lake Road restriction or a Wild Basin area restriction. And what we did during those times is we would stop incoming traffic because parking lots were congested, roadways were getting congested, and we were getting to kind of a critical mass where it was getting to the point where everything was congested and our ability to respond to an emergency was compromised with that. So that would take that same concept, but apply it out to the park entrance stations. So, the trade-off there is there'd be no advanced planning for visitors. but there would be some uncertainty when these metering closures would happen at the park entrance stations. Likely during the summer, early and late in the season, you'd probably not have to have these implemented. But, for example, in July, weekends in September, these could happen early in the day and last most of the day. Let's take a look at some of our complementary ideas. So we have a host of other ideas that are area specific based. Now, these could be used standalone, or they could be nested under one of the other ideas that was presented already. These area specific ideas deal with and address an issue in a specific area, such as Long's Peak or Wild Basin. For example, Long's Peak could require a permit for the hike, not necessarily a permit with a limit, but a permit, getting visitors to obtain a permit gives us an opportunity to ensure that they're prepared for that hike and also, ready to, take on that kind of experience. Wild Basin, kind of same thing. It's a, one road in and out in a smaller area, tends to fill up quickly, where we could do maybe just reservations for Wild Basin or some other, idea or element of the ideas previously. Let's take a look at some more complementary strategies. The two on the screen here, shuttle buses, as mentioned earlier, have been a long-standing tool here at the park, and there's many things that we could do to kind of enhance our current shuttle system and or make new routes within the park. But we don't see shuttle systems as a standalone solution to the issues that we're facing in the park, more as a tool that could be used in combination with one of these other strategies. The same goes for education and trip planning. Again, the park already does a lot of education and advanced trip planning tools and information that is put out there for the public. Of course, we can always do more, and really beneficial to reach people, have them informed before they even show up to the park. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rachel.
Thanks, John. I'm going to walk through a couple of next steps of where we're going, take a look at our schedule and this current comment period, and then we will start into our Q&A. So if you've had a question brewing or something you're still noodling about, you can go ahead and start getting that into the chat, and let's talk through a couple of next steps. So this project has three major phases. We've talked, Kyle talked a little bit about the previous civic engagement that came up last year. We really were focusing that session on, and that series of time, on identifying our purpose and need for the project and initiating that civic engagement, really getting a good understanding of what problem are we solving and what are the connected issues that we are really wanting to look at. We have moved into this phase 2 of the project, where we are really looking at what are the potential strategies and ideas, as John talked about, that help us really meet needs, resolve issues, and provide a quality experience of the park as we go forward. And we want to get your thoughts and feedback on that. What do you think about the ideas that we're considering? What other things could we be considering as we go into this next phase of our planning? And what about those other ideas make them desirable and feasible and really help us to achieve project objectives? That's super useful information for us to understand. Then once we wrap that up, we're going to take all of that public comment, all of those ideas, all the analysis that we've been doing, and start working on strategy refinement, conducting analyses, and putting together that first draft of the draft plan. Once we have that draft plan together, we will hold public meetings and more civic engagement, put that plan out for review, and get thoughts and feedback, make any updates before we make a final plan. We are forecasting to be having that final plan ready and available in early 24. And so that's when we're expecting to have kind of a final decision on this overall process. But let's circle back to where we are right now, as opposed to being in the big picture. We are in the middle of a civic engagement series between now and February 1st. we genuinely do want to hear from folks, and specifically on these two questions. As you start to think about your desired experiences and the protection of resources at the park, what ideas, or as John noted, combinations of ideas, do you think best achieve the purpose of the plan? How do they support a quality experience for you? We also want to hear what other changes or ideas to the current thoughts that we have could be considered and analyzed we haven't already presented. And the best way to provide that feedback is to follow the URL that's both on the screen and it's been in chat a couple times throughout this presentation, and also on the Parks website, to go directly into there to learn more about the project, really sit with those ideas, and then provide us your feedback into the NPS system. So like I noted, we're going to have this comment period up through the beginning of February. We really do want to hear from as many folks as we can. I cannot emphasize enough how critical your participation is at this stage for us. Getting that critically informs our process, helps us make sure that we're evaluating all of the right ideas, really broadens our perspective to help us understand your perspectives on both the issues and the ideas that we're considering. We're going to be using that to inform decision-making and priority investing, and how we're going into the next phases of planning. So again, to learn more about anything we've talked about in the presentation today, I would encourage you to check out the story map. That URL is on the screen. It's been in chat too. We'll continue to push that through as a reminder for folks, and additional details that are there on the screen at the project website. So with that, I've been watching questions roll into our Q&A feature, which is great. We really want to have time to dig into those Q&As. And I see that as we get closer to the end of the presentation, they are picking up the pace. So what we are going to do is take a quick 2-minute break. That's going to allow y'all some time to kind of gather your thoughts together, put your questions into chat, and help us kind of get organized in the background. We're kind of organizing them by theme and seeing some duplicate questions in there as well. I do want to let folks know as we head into the Q&A, I am sure that this is a curious group of folks who has a lot of questions about the park. We are going to focus our time together today on answering questions related to the day use visitor access plan that we are working on, and the long-term planning that is the focus of this meeting. And so if you have other questions, someone will respond to you in the chat with how to get a good answer on that. But just so you know, we're going to be focusing this Q&A period on those primary questions related to this planning effort, the long-term planning that's going on, and the topics related to that. So with that, we're going to take that 2-minute break. We will be right back to start going through the Q&A. And feel free to either go grab a water or an updated snack if you need to during those 2 minutes. And then we'll jump into the Q&A. Okay, I see a lot of great questions coming in. So let's go ahead and get started into our Q&A portion of our agenda. So this first question is for Darla. We had a question about how involved the park is in diffusing traffic before it gets to the East Side gates by promoting visitor use in Grand Lake or the National Forest. They're huge compared to the park, have some really similar scenery. What's our relationship like with our partners in the other federal land management agencies, and how are we working together?
Okay, very good. Thanks for that question. Yeah, we have about a 3.5 year long partnership with many of those entities through a collaborative effort called the NOCO, Northern Colorado 2050. And that is made up of Rocky Mountain National Park, Arapahoe Roosevelt National Forest, the 5 Front Range counties. And we meet very regularly and have been addressing this topic of growing visitation and attraction to all of our public lands in Colorado for quite some time. So we try to piggyback off each other, the efforts that we have done and been successful at, and communicate very frequently on ways to, disperse visitation and ways to manage our visitor use. And so obviously we work, very closely too with Grand Lake and Estes Park, and even have conversations with Lions as well. We don't, promote or advertise or market the park. That's just not something the National Park Service does, but it is really critical that we work with those partners, both, local, county, state, federal, and have those conversations. So does that answer the question? Anything else to add, Kyle or John?
No, I don't have anything to add, Darla.
No, I think that covers it.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, but John, don't go too far. This next one's for you.
All right.
There's a question that folks have about if the park can provide real-time information about what lots are full, what roads are busy, why or why not, why would or wouldn't we do that?
Yeah, I think that falls into that, education and information component. We have tried various kind of experiments or mini pilots with that. One of the examples in 2015, we set up webcams on the park on the Fall River and the Beaver Meadows entrance stations to try to let facing out to the traffic to try to let people see ahead of time how busy those entrance stations were. The other thing is we've used variable message signs within the park to some success. I think there's more that can be done there, but some of the challenges with using real-time information, the park, even in this modern age, we're still kind of isolated. Cell coverage is limited throughout the park. Infrastructure for communication is somewhat limited. So if we make some strides there, some of those technologies become more feasible. On the other side of that, it takes a lot of effort and and some staffing to gather up that real-time information and filter it out. Folks here in Colorado, the Colorado Department of Transportation has a 24-hour staffed center that manages, all the highway signs, the variable message signs on the highway. It's quite an effort to provide real-time information. So from that standpoint, it's challenging there. The other thing that kind of helps us at Rocky is our travel patterns by visitors tend to be quite predictable. So a lot of times we can say with certainty, within a half hour of when parking lots typically fill up. That's a great idea for, providing more real-time information. Certainly going to be part of the mix with any of these strategies that we choose. But again, there are some hurdles to get over to get us to there.
Great, thanks for that. And I've got two more for you before we keep bouncing around related to strategies while we're on the topic. So let's do the first one is, has the park considered separate access gates for staff and commuters for those who travel from the east to the west side? How do we think about those types of issues and considerations?
Yeah, we have considered that. You know, we had a fast pass lane that we utilized for several years. Again, you know, there's been some technology challenges there as technologies change and things update. Certainly, you know, I think we do have some plans in the future. We have a more of a kind of a near-term plan at the Beaver Meadows entrance station to extend that lane down a little bit to facilitate not only our staff, our shuttle buses, but eventually, you know, possibly used for incoming traffic as well for visitors. You know, those things are infrastructure fixes. So, you know, they're nice, but we have a lot of infrastructure that we have to take care of. So we have to balance building new infrastructure for caring for the current infrastructure that we have. So yeah, great idea. I think we have some movement towards that, but you know, not anything concrete here in the next few years.
Okay, and then I think there's a follow-up question on our strategy section. Have we thought about capping daily numbers? What scenario might that look like, and what are our thoughts on it?
Yeah, you know, the idea for there with the metering is kind of leans towards capping the daily numbers. You know, to implement that strategy on the ground, you know, not only we need feedback from what's happening within the park, but I think we have an idea right now of, you know, our vehicle-based capacity within the park. So we most likely would be looking at, you know, when we reach that number for the day is how we would determine that closure. So yeah, looking at the numbers, you know, and capping the use, you know, really all these plans are based at, you know, the number of visitors, but the way that we implement that is through the vehicles. Because, you know, those impacts are not only on our roadways and in our parking lots, but also on our trails and in our infrastructure, such as restrooms and things like that. So, yeah, definitely that would be part of that strategy for sure. But also the other reservation strategies would be based on a total number for the day.
Great, thanks for that, John. Kyle, I have one for you coming up next. There's a question wondering about how do we feel that TEPS 2022 worked for meeting park goals? What are our reflections as we look back on last summer?
Great, thank you so much for that question. And it's been a very important aspect of our pilots. That's truly why they're pilots, is we really are trying to learn and tweak and adjust. And we've learned a lot from 2020, 21, 22. So 22, again, we were successful at spreading use out throughout the park and throughout the day, as John mentioned. So 2022 visitation was a little different than 2021. So 2021, oftentimes the reservations sold out. In fact, every day they sold out in 2021. In 2022, we saw on some days there was still some availability. And so oftentimes that was tied to overall travel trends with 2022. So a lot of travel experts have indicated that travel was a little different in 2022 for probably the reasons we all would surmise. Gas prices were certainly part of that, but usually gas prices don't have as much of an impact in Rocky Mountain National Park because 30 to 40% of our visitors come from a very close proximity to the park, many from Colorado. Inflation was also an issue, and although we'd love to all have COVID behind us, COVID illnesses are also attributed to this. Maybe you're traveling with a group or family, somebody becomes ill, you have to cancel it. And so your long time bookings were shorter this year, but then people felt better, they changed their plans, and short-term bookings were up this year, is what we're hearing from our gateway communities and the Lodging Association. So those travel trends were a little different. Again, we saw very similar patterns that people would come in and take advantage of that rest of the park access prior to 9. So we'd have this blip at 8, which we managed for. And after 3 o'clock, we would see a little blip as well. So those were very common and the same as previous years. We also, certainly connected with visitors who were just a little bit more aware of the system because this was our 3rd year of piloting. So a lot of the questions that we were receiving from the public, they were calling ahead, they were planning ahead, and they were making suggestions as to how we might change it or how we might be able to share information better. So the awareness seemed to be better. That said, we also had people that came to the park that were not aware of the timed entry permit system too. So we know that that's an ongoing effort to educate people about the importance of planning ahead, not only at Rocky Mountain National Park, but other public lands, as Darla mentioned. John, do you have any other take-home messages from 2022 that we learned?
No, I think that it was a pretty good summary. Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing to note there is, when we're planning for the timed entry, we're also taking into account those visitors that do come in and after. It's part of our overall total. So it's not just within the reservation period.
Okay, great. Kyle, I have 2 more for you. We'll take them one at a time. Just want to know I'm coming back your way. Has any thought been given to local residents with some kind of priority or differential access to the park, looking ahead to the long term?
Thank you, Rachel. And certainly we understand that question because we know that Rocky Mountain National Park is a beloved national park, not only to people throughout the United States and world, but also to local residents who oftentimes move to this area to have those spontaneous experiences in Rocky. I think it's really just important to note that Rocky Mountain National Park is a national park. So to give special access or treatment to locals is certainly something that we are mindful of because we are a national park. So we have to level the playing field there. Again, most of our visitors, 30 to 40%, are coming from the Front Range area and also Colorado. So a lot of our visitors are locals, however you want to define that. Is a local somebody who lives in the Gateway community? Is it somebody who lives in Fort Collins but comes up here every weekend, or is it a Colorado resident that's a local? So certainly the definition of a local will probably change depending on who you are and where you live. So our actions and ideas and strategies really need to focus on the same access for others. We also hope that if you're a local, your proximity will be a benefit. So you are able to plan ahead, hopefully more as far as your entrance and exit into the park, and take advantage of those opportunities that others that maybe live out of the local area don't have that same latitude to do. But again, we also understand that this impacts any of the ideas we're looking at, certainly impacts some of that spontaneity of visiting Rocky Mountain National Park.
Okay, great. And I've got 1 more for you, Kyle. Thanks for hanging with us. There's a question about the idea for shuttle-only access to some areas might limit handicapped or people with mobility devices and their accessibility. So how might we be thinking about how shuttle buses could be modified to allow for multiple mobility device users or be readily accessible to accommodate enough other people if the lines get really long? Where's the park on accessibility and our updates related to that specifically for shuttles?
Wonderful. So thank you for that question. And it's something that we certainly are considering. And as far as the shuttle bus and the access for accessibility, I will toss that to John because he is the shuttle bus transportation coordinator for the park. So he can elaborate on our shuttle bus contract and their requirements to provide that type of access on their buses. But before I toss it over to John, certainly that's something we look at, and why John mentioned that shuttles are a wonderful tool, to incorporate. But we also know that shuttles can't be the only answer for a variety of reasons. The whole concept of people and individuals being on a shuttle and then surging at trailheads and what that does to widening the trails, what that does to social trails as people are trying to get around others, what it does to our infrastructure and operational capacity, and then where do people park to access those shuttles, and are those areas accessible? So all of those things are certainly part of the shuttle conundrum. Shuttles are an amazing tool, but they're not the only answer. And so that's certainly something that we're acknowledging and addressing, is the pros and cons of shuttles. For the specific question about accessibility, though, John, if you could share our shuttle bus provider and the accessibility that they provide.
Yeah, so our shuttle buses are required that they're all accessible to meet, ADA, ABA standards. The contractor that we use with all the equipment is able to accommodate most devices, and the staff is trained to, properly assist in loading and that. And speaking directly to the idea 2 that was presented, we understand that there are other devices that, are used for accessibility that, may be troublesome or cumbersome to get on a shuttle bus. I think in those cases, we'd have the ability to allow people to take their private vehicle up to the trailhead. Again, remember, under that idea, it's only going to be closed for kind of that peak period of the day. So we would be allowing private vehicle use prior to and after that. What those times, what times we land on, we're looking for you for suggestions on that. But yeah, I think there's a ways around that, because, we understand that there's all kinds of accessibility needs and all kinds of equipment that's, that is needed to facilitate that. So not, even though the buses meet the standard, it's like anything technology based, the standards, a few years old, and the tech is way ahead of the standard. So we'd be able to make accommodations, just by contacting the park or, a ranger in the field there would help you out.
Thanks, John. Rachel, if I could just tag on a little bit more too, of just the whole importance we understand of the flexibility and spontaneity to drive through the park too is really key and important to many visitors' experience at Rocky Mountain National Park. So Rocky was created in 1915 when vehicles were just becoming popular. And so a big part of Rocky Mountain National Park's history and connection to visitors throughout the decades is to have that experience as well, where you have that freedom to drive in the park. We also know that we've spent millions and millions of dollars with our partnership with Federal Highways to improve some of our roads. Bear Lake Road built in 1928, Trailridge Road built in 1932. These are amazing scenic roads that people also enjoy being able to drive on. So again, it's that balance of how can we incorporate vehicles and shuttles depending on the spot and location.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kyle and John. I'm going to jump over to a question for Darla. We have kind of a two-parter or some connected questions. There's a question about, is it possible or feasible for us to duplicate the Bear Lake Road corridor in another part of the park to help kind of disperse use, but that would require a lot of building and development. So I think there's a connected question there related to, is funding potentially an obstacle to implement these strategies, or what other sideboards are we thinking about as we approach kind of strategy identification and feasibility?
Okay, so in terms of additional infrastructure and building new roads or new parking lots or those kinds of things, we're really very limited here at Rocky with the ability to do that. And some of that is just having to do with when this park was established and when the Wilderness Act designated, as Kyle mentioned, about 95% of the park is designated wilderness. And so we're limited in terms of, where we could develop additional infrastructure. But the other thing is we realize, we can't really build our way out of this, that kind of the motto, you build it, they will come. It's still a finite land resource, and the park is, actually pretty small. It's about 265,000 acres. And so, it would just exacerbate, I think, the crowding and congestion to continue to build additional infrastructure for visitors. So that's not so much on the table. However, we are looking at some opportunities to potentially like expand the shuttle bus service. If you're familiar with the park, like up to the Deer Ridge Junction area, those kinds of ideas. So there could be additional routes, shuttle routes and things like that we could do. Potential, future connector trails and those sorts of things. Rachel, remind me the second part of that question.
Are there any funding constraints to pursuing any of these strategies or other sideboards that would kind of limit what we can and can't consider?
Yes, definitely. The National Park Service is pretty well known for having a lot of deferred maintenance. In other words, maintenance backlog that we just don't have the ability to fund. The park here at Rocky has about $120 million backlog. We have over 500 buildings in the park, and many of those buildings are historic. They're very expensive to maintain, and we just acknowledge that we have a lot to take care of already, and so the funding is definitely part of that. Did that answer the question?
I did, and I think for folks, if you have a follow-up on your question, you feel free to drop them in and let us know, and we can circle back. Okay, next question in my queue is for John. John, we've got some folks that are curious about what work we've done to understand the carrying capacity or visitor capacities within the park.
Yeah, that's a key element. As was mentioned in the presentation, we're using the visitor use management framework, the interagency framework that was developed, and carrying capacity is a key component of that. And so we've done a fair amount of work on trying to figure out the carrying capacity in Rocky. And the way we're going about it is not looking at, the park as a whole, because the park has some very distinct areas. And so we're looking at it, area by area that have, Bear Lake Road Corridor, for example. That's an area that has some specific uses and some specific, limiting attributes to that. And so we use those to help us determine the capacity for that. I think once overall, we'll have, once we, get the carrying capacity for the different areas, we'll have an overall sense of the park. Rocky's a very interesting park where, you look at somewhere like the Bear Lake Road Corridor is much more highly used than the west side of the park for most of the time. So it's kind of a dynamic place, and it's not one size fits all on the carrying capacity as well. I'm going to let Rachel chime in on that one too, because Rachel's been a part of that, helping us with carrying capacity in case I missed something key there.
No, I don't think you missed anything. I think we're, again, like John noted, we're following the interagency process for what it looks like to identify capacities. Again, the whole role and purpose of that part of the process is to help us really understand what are the types and amounts of use that help us achieve our desired conditions, and do we need other strategies to employ in our management that help us manage to those identified things. So again, it goes back to what are we managing for? What does resource protection look like related to that? What are the limiting attributes in a specific area? And how can we go through that? So again, if folks are curious about what that process looks like, we are following the process outlined by the IVUMC, or the Interagency Visitor Use Management Council. And all of that information is publicly available on the IVUMC's website. And you'll be seeing more on that as we put the draft plan together, which is great. We're actively working on it. Okay, next question is also for John. Another question about strategies. I love how curious folks are getting about these different ideas and strategies we could consider. It's amazing. But there's a trailhead specific question for you. Is the NPS considering trailhead specific permits like Brainerd Lake does?
Yeah, that's an option that we are considering. the slide we had on area specific trails or area specific strategies. They could be applied to a trail or kind of a cluster of trail systems. You know, Longs Peak is probably, you know, the easy low hanging fruit example of that, because, you know, that hike is kind of unique in itself, especially if you're trying to summit Longs. But there could be other areas of the park that, you know, if they contain sensitive resources, natural or cultural, that we would want to, you know, limit or manage that use in that specific area. You know, the other thing that happens from time to time, if you think of Hanging Lake here in Colorado, that rose to popularity off of social media. You know, it was busy and pristine before, but, you know, after social media hit the scene, their use really accelerated there. And so, you know, same thing could happen here at Rocky, where we would need to address an area specific, you know, be that Adams Falls on the west side, or, you know, you name it, whatever the next popular trend is.
Great. Also for you, John, a question about re-entry. The question is, would entry through a specific entrance limit re-entry through another entrance? So for example, if I start my day and I come in Fall River and I drive over Trail Ridge to Grand Lake, but then I want to come back in the Grand Lake side to return to Estes Park, how would that work?
Yeah, we would allow that kind of re-entry and stuff. You actually described one of the very popular things that does happen in the park. We do get a lot of cross-park travel, where, you know, part of their park experience is going to have lunch, or the most popular one I hear is going for ice cream in Grand Lake. So yeah, we would definitely allow re-entries through that. I think, you know, the tip for you when you're commenting on these strategies is make sure that you include that in there, is that, you know, re-entry is important to you, and you know, any suggestions you had on how that might be accomplished or you know, done, we're all ears on that.
Okay, and one more for you, related to the idea 3 on daily reservations. Curious if there's been a pilot of idea 3 to get an idea of just how kind of that would work with a daily reservation. Have we piloted it? What does that look like?
So we haven't piloted it here at Rocky. We started out with timed entry, but Yosemite had used a day reservation, as well as Glacier, you know, which their visitation makeup certainly is different than Rocky, but you know, we can certainly learn from those. I think the biggest takeaway from that strategy is that they were working with, or takeaway from their pilots, is they were working with a very low number of reservations on each day, partly because, you know, of the timing of the coming out of COVID, but also because the uncertainty, you know, they didn't know exactly how that use would be distributed as well. Rocky, I think we have some good data over the years that, you know, sets up that 10 to 2 crunch that we have. So I think we know we have a pretty good idea. If we did daily reservations, we better plan to that crunch period of 10 to 2 and stuff. So yeah, not done at Rocky, done other places. And again, that we can learn from them, but it's not, you know, I don't want to sit here and tell you it's a 1-for-1 comparison of the other parks. Okay, thanks, John. Gonna pop over. The next one is for Kyle. Kyle, there's a question for you about how none of the strategies that we've mentioned so far are specific on months of the year when timed entry would be in place. What are the months that are planned? Kind of what's our thinking about seasonality?
Thank you. So certainly our highest visitation numbers currently are Memorial Day weekend through mid to late October. And for those of you that are very familiar with mountain weather in Colorado, you know that our Mays and Octobers can vary widely based on weather. So if we have a wet Memorial Day weekend, our visitation might be down. If we have Trailridge Road open a little bit longer, our visitation is going to be up in October. So typically it's Memorial Day weekend through mid to late October. So that's really when we're seeing the main impacts in the park. And so those are the main areas that we're focusing on, is basically those 5 months where we see the high visitation and impacts. That said, for those of you that are familiar to Rocky over the last couple of years, you'll know that we're seeing a pretty steady increase in weekends in the winter. So in places like Hidden Valley and Bear Lake and other places on the east side of the park during winter weekends. And so we've actually had to manage access to the Bear Lake Road corridor many weekends when we've had a really good fresh snow because of just the crowding and the parking. But really what we're focusing on with our ideas and strategies is that Memorial Day weekend through mid to late October time period, where we historically have been the busiest. And then we also continue to adapt on those weekends where oftentimes we don't have the staffing or the volunteers to assist us, but we still have that high visitation, really concentrated on weekends though.
Okay, great. I've got another two-parter for you, Kyle, so don't go too far. Related to kind of how we're sharing and communicating on these different types of systems as we be going forward. So the first part of that question is for idea one. What are our plans for communicating how to make the times clear about timed entry? How do we share that information both before a ticket's purchased and once they have it?
Great, thank you. We've received a lot of great input and feedback from the public and our partners as well, and continued efforts to want to assist the park and us work with partners to get the word out. So I guess a couple of thoughts pertaining to that. One is kind of goes along with what we were talking about earlier, is that more people do seem to be aware of timed entry permit systems, whether it's at Rocky or other locations. So people are planning ahead. They're realizing that they might need to look at things differently than they have in the past. So we do see that improving, but we also see people that are not aware of the timed entry permit system. So ways that we've tried to help in that situation is the earlier we can release information about what our plans are for next year, the better. So we've certainly heard that from folks, just to be able to know for sure, so that there's not, are they going to do that again? So our commitment continues to be to try to release that information as soon as we can, so that people can plan ahead. We're really fortunate to have great relationships with Estes Park and Grand Lake communities, both of their towns as well as their tourism partners. So Grand Lake Chamber, Visit Estes Park, Grand County Tourism, Colorado Tourism Office. So we partner with them, and in fact, Visit Estes Park, through a grant with Colorado Tourism Office, did a whole video series called Do Estes Right. And it's a variety of things. It's how to leave no trace. It's how to plan ahead. It's how to watch the weather. But they did a great one on the timed entry permit system, really highlighting what that looks like and how you can plan ahead. I think the comment was, how can we educate on the times, the prior to 9, after 3, how the rest of the park is different than Bear Lake Road corridor. We continue to hopefully improve our graphics on some of these pilots that we're doing. We really try to get information on our website, of course, very prominent. We're very social media, very popular for Rocky Mountain National Park. But the partnerships that we have are really critical, and the proactive things that our partners are doing, whether it's the tourism industry or, for instance, lodging establishments, that they're really reaching out proactively to their guests and letting them know, hey, you're coming during this time. Here's how you need to plan ahead. Here's what you need to do. Let me know if I can help you. We know that a lot of some of the proactive lodging organizations and VRBOs are helping people manage that and really giving them that information, which then think helps all of us. It's a win-win in that situation. But those are areas that we can always improve on and expand on, and there could be audiences that we're not reaching. So, continue to hope that we get good feedback and input on some suggestions on other outreach efforts. The other thing too to share is when somebody goes on and Google's timed entry, for instance, Rocky Mountain National Park is the first thing that jumps up on Google. So that's a really positive thing that the word is getting out, but we continue to look at ways we can improve it and are all ears.
Great. And then one more for you, Kyle, then we'll hop to another topic, but there was a question about have we considered or how might we consider kind of special access for folks who are, for example, entering on bicycles versus in a vehicle, and how does that interact with the lines?
Great. So currently with our pilots, if you're aware of our pilots from 2020 through 2022, bicycles do not have to get a timed entry permit reservation. So they certainly have to have a pass, as all visitors do, but they do not need a timed entry reservation system. And again, it's really, as John has mentioned before, looking at all the different uses, whether it's shuttle use, whether it's private vehicles, whether it's people on foot or on bicycles. So those people that are entering the park through a bicycle do not need a timed entry permit system. The other thing too is we're continuing to look at ways that we can encourage bicycle use in the park. A number of years ago, we made some changes on Old Fall River Road, for instance, and had a little bit of a window at the end of the season to allow the road to be closed for the season to vehicles, but for there to be bicycle access on the road. And we got a lot of really good feedback, and we still to this day that cyclists really like that opportunity to have just maybe that month and a half of that road where they can recreate and not necessarily have to share the road with vehicles. And we're continuing to look at ways that we can expand, encouraging other use in the park with bicycles. Also, understanding that, as we've talked about before, we have an infrastructure in place that oftentimes, probably needs to be more experienced cyclists that are taking the highest continuous paved road in the United States, Trail Ridge Road, that they need to plan ahead and know what they're getting into if they go to those high elevations. So part of it is educating, where a good place is if you're a cyclist coming into Rocky Mountain National Park.
Okie doke. Thanks so much, Kyle. The next question, I'm heading over to John. John, there's a question for you about, we've talked about some area-specific locations in the park, but not all areas of the park. So folks are curious, is this plan also going to look at congestion issues at other locations without entrance stations such as Lily Lake?
Yeah, the plan definitely is. This is a park-wide plan. So we're looking at all areas of the park. And especially, we are, like I mentioned earlier, when we're looking at carrying capacity, we're looking at those, area-specific ones. And that definitely applies to those that are areas of the park that aren't behind an entrance station or don't have an entrance station at them. In the question, Lily Lake was mentioned. That's a great example. Lumpy Ridge, it'd be another one. We're looking at those areas specifically because, if you think about the use at Lily Lake, it again, like Long's Peak, every area has kind of a different, bent on the type of use that happens there. Lily Lake, we see, a shorter duration of people. There's shorter duration stay at Lily Lake than some other areas of the park. But, yet there's, parking issues there. Demand is high most of the time, especially on weekends. So, yeah, every area in the park is getting looked at. And that's why, we have the kind of the overarching ideas. But then the area specific ones, and like I mentioned when we were talking about those, there may be some ideas that nest under an overall plan and could be applied to Lily Lake or Lumpy Ridge specifically. So yeah, everything in the park, it's a pretty comprehensive plan. We're not just looking at Bear Lake, we're looking at everywhere. The other reason we're doing that, for what I mentioned, is anytime you manage use in a specific area, you can inadvertently push more use to an area that's not ready to handle that or should not get that kind of use. So those are the kind of things that we have to consider when we take an action, say in the Bear Lake corridor. Where does that push use? Does it push use to Deer Ridge Mountain or Deer Ridge? Or does it push use to Lily Lake or Lumpy Ridge? So yeah, we're taking all that into consideration. And again, I encourage you, if you have any specific ideas about an area like Lily Lake, let us know. We'd love to hear it.
Awesome. Thanks. John, I have one more for you related to ideas. There's a question about why reservations are released 30 days in advance instead of a longer time period. It's a little bit challenging to book, and it's also impossible to book a same-day reservation. So what are our kind of evolving thoughts on time periods and releases?
That's a great way to tee it up, Rachel. It is evolving. Yeah, we're taking, again, the pilots that we've done are a great way to learn what our visitors need. But to give you a little bit of the backstory, we're required to use recreation.gov for reservations because we're a federal land management agency. It's a multi-agency contract that runs the reservation systems through rec.gov. But if you think about it, rec.gov started doing campground reservations, then they kind of moved to cave tours. Timed entries, still kind of, even though we've been doing it for 3 years and under pilots, still kind of a new thing for them. And we work with them every year to try to make changes and enhancements. We got to the 30-day release starting in 2020 because that's what they could set up for us. We worked to look at expanding that. We've made some changes to the night before. The first year we were 48 hours before. Now we were able to move it to the night before. So yeah, that's the perfect word I would have chosen. It's evolving, and we're looking at that because we understand there's different needs by visitors. Some folks need to plan well in advance. If you're coming from out of state, you need to book your hotel. You need to, book getting into the park. But then it's been mentioned previously, we have a lot of local visitors that, that 30-day release really works for, and especially the night before ones as well. So finding that right balance, I think that's going to take us a few years to figure out, and we're still getting there.
Okay, thanks for that info. Kyle, wandering back over your direction for this one. There's a question about why we're talking about being concerned about overcrowding, and yet we seem to be advertising a lot for people to come to the park. So as the person who does a lot of comms for the park, thoughts?
Absolutely. So we don't advertise or market Rocky Mountain National Park. So hopefully, if you happen to follow us on social media, we're at Rocky NPS. We have a really robust social media following. We have, about 750,000 people that follow us on Facebook, around 650,000 that follow us on Instagram. And a lot of our messaging is really tied to information and education and highlighting some of the things that our staff do and some of the reasons why Rocky was set aside. Our gateway communities and certainly Colorado Tourism Office certainly promote Rocky Mountain National Park and other public lands as a draw to the area and their economy. So certainly national parks are a huge economic driver to our local communities and support our businesses and our neighbors and our sales tax revenue. So certainly those are all intertwined. And so that's why our partnerships with Visit Estes Park and Grand County Tourism, Grand Lake Chamber, Colorado Tourism Office are so important. Colorado Tourism Office just recently created a Destination Stewardship Council, and Rocky Mountain National Park is on that council. And a lot of it is, how can these tourism organizations market, promote, or advertise while still being mindful of the impacts that advertising and marketing and promotion do for public lands, places like Rocky Mountain National Park. And so we continue to work very closely with them on their messaging. We talked a little bit about Visit Estes Parks, Do Estes Right campaign. Colorado Tourism Office has a really close relationship with Leave No Trace. In fact, it was the first time the Tourism Office and Leave No Trace partnered, the whole concept of Call Already. So if you're coming to Colorado, if you're coming to our public lands, we want you to enjoy them, but we also want you to help take care of them. And so there does seem to be a pretty concerted effort to make sure that it's responsible tourism and marketing to Rocky Mountain National Park and all of Colorado. Main reason people come to Colorado is public lands. So it's really important that they continue that campaign, and we continue to encourage them to do that, and we'll work really closely with them. And we hope that you follow us on social media and see that a lot of our posts are mainly about information, education, planning ahead, watching the weather as well.
Hey, great. Thanks, Kyle. And I am a dedicated Rocky Instagram follower for all of that great messaging. Next question, heading over to Darla. There's a question about if we have any plans to start addressing staffing shortages.
Very good. Thanks for that question. Yes, staffing is very often an issue and a challenge for us here at Rocky. However, we're not alone. Both with other public land management agencies here in Colorado as well as across the Park Service. Here locally in Rocky, we really have a challenge with housing. And so it's difficult to attract and retain great candidates because of the cost of housing, because of the lack of availability of housing. So it's not just a funding issue. We rely very heavily on our amazing volunteer staff. We've got literally thousands of them, and a lot of the local folks in Grand Lake and Estes Park are our volunteers. And so that is a really key part of some of our staffing as well. And, you know, when we're not able to staff things as much as we might like, we certainly rely on those volunteer staff. But in terms of getting additional staff, we are, you know, of course, limited by the funding we have. Our funding streams come from a couple of different sources. One is our base budget, and that is designated by Congress. We get an annual base budget every year. And then the entrance fees and the campground fees that visitors pay, that is called our Federal Land Recreation Enhancement Act funding. Those funds, we're able to retain about 80% of those. And those funds go toward a number of different things, all visitor related. And we are able to hire some seasonal staff with that funding stream as well. So we do the best with the funding that we have. We're very creative. And over the past, 6 years, as we've tried these different strategies with visitor use management, we're kind of mixing and matching staff to figure out what is the best staffing plan to help, implement all of these different pilots and experiments we're doing. But we, it's a continual challenge, and we're very grateful again for the volunteers. We're grateful for our cooperating agency or association, Rocky Mountain Conservancy. They're our 501c3 partner, and they assist with a lot of those kinds of things as well. And they can often, hire staff on their side that help. For example, youth crews. We got a lot of youth crews through Rocky Mountain Conservancy that help to work on trails. So it's not just the Rocky paid staff. We have a lot of other avenues as well.
Okay, thanks so much. Next one's heading over back to Kyle. There's a question about how has been or how is the park continuing to consider the needs of those without internet interfacing, I think maybe with these systems or general interactions with the park.
Great, thank you for that question. Certainly one of the things that is the pros and cons of some of the ideas we share is the whole concept of internet access and if there are communities that have internet access, or if there's others that don't, or don't have the understanding or interest or capability. So it's all of the above with internet and connectivity issues. We're really fortunate that a lot of libraries, we'll give a specific shout out to the Estes Valley Library, has helped a number of people access reservations that don't have internet connectivity. So that's certainly been, very helpful, or they just are, needing extra assistance and help with the reservation system with the internet. We also know that recreation.gov has a number that you can call in and actually make the reservation, timed entry permit reservation through their phone number rather than going through the internet connectivity. However, we also realize that oftentimes their confirmation goes to somebody's email. So again, we need to make sure that we continue to have options and availability for people that do not have internet connectivity or have challenges with the internet. And so continuing to work with partners like the Estes Valley Library, who do a wonderful job of educating people. And I'm pretty sure that there's many other libraries that have done that same exact thing, not only for helping people through Rocky's pilot timed entry recreation.gov, but helping people just with internet access in general, and how that continues to be a way that people access everything, whether it's patient health care or everything. And so we want to make sure that we're connecting with those folks as we look at these potential ideas and solutions. We want to work with our partners for other avenues to connect with people about how they might be able to book reservations. So is there something we can do where there's a guest checkout for recreation.gov where people can go on and they don't necessarily need to have an email or an internet connection? So those are all things that we're continuing to think through, is how can we assist those that might not have that availability of internet where they are.
Great, thank you, Kyle. Next question, going over to John. Someone's asking if we're creating new zones for visitor use in the park as a part of this plan.
Yeah, that's
right
a
in your
great
wheelhouse.
question. Yeah, we actually are. It's again, we'll go back to the good old framework there. That's one of the steps in the framework, is to create zones in the park. Again, the zones help us, put common elements together. Not only, in this plan, mainly centered around visitor use, but that helps us. Each zone has a different set of desired conditions. I mean, naturally, there's going to be crossover and desired conditions throughout the whole park, but each zone is tied to what visitors can expect, what type of experience visitors can expect in that zone, as well as what kind of conditions you can find the resource in, and also the infrastructure as well. So, just as an example, the deep backcountry of the park is designated wilderness. The wilderness legislation gives us a set of desired conditions to start off with. But we've zoned most of the backcountry of the park as it's one single zone because there's common traits there. It's a very wilderness experience. The trails are more primitive nature, not as hardened, not as wide, and also use is a little less in those areas as well. So that's the type of experience you can see there. The zones we did in the first round of civic engagement that was mentioned earlier in the program back in May of 21, the zones were presented, and we got some public comment on the zones there. But yeah, the zones help us, kind of group together the desired conditions that we're shooting for. And to a certain extent, the zones kind of lined up with the use that we want to see and the levels of use in those areas. Again, I'll see if Rachel has anything that she wants to add on zones, because that's another area of her expertise.
I think I'd emphasize a point that John made about, part of what we're doing is trying to be really clear and articulate about what are we managing for and why and what's that connected to, and just calling back to what Kyle mentioned about those fundamental resources and values in park, the wilderness values of the park. That's all connected to how we articulate what are we managing for and why is it important to us and how it interacts with our decision-making process. So then I'm going to jump over. It looks like we have one more question before we get to the top. We're going to squeeze an extra just couple of minutes out of this meeting to get to this one, and then we'll wrap up. So this one's for Kyle. Kyle, folks are curious what types of wildlife impacts we're seeing with increased visitor use.
Great, thank you. So I think pertaining to wildlife, the best way to just describe that, for those of you who have been to Rocky or have other beloved public lands that you're familiar with where you have a lot of wildlife, it's one of the main reasons people come to Rocky, has for 107 years, watchable wildlife. Scenic beauty, recreational opportunities, those are all the top three. So a lot of the wildlife in Rocky Mountain National Park is right nearby road corridors. That's why the elk rut is such an amazing experience in Rockies, because you're seeing it right close to the roads. Many of you also realize we have a ton of congestion during that time of year, so it impacts just the general migration and movement of elk. If you've been here in the fall, you likely have seen it. And so certainly trying to think through this congestion, not only impacting visitors, but also just wildlife migration and movement is certainly something that maybe you've seen yourself. And we certainly have been tracking and seeing that increase. Also, just think about just overall health of habitat. So when you think of some of the degradation we've seen on the tundra and the species that really rely on that habitat, like pika and ptarmigan, when you have that denuded bare ground and you are impacting their habitat, pika need it to live and eat. And so those are all things that are really, really critical when we're looking at the impacts and the resource protection is of the wildlife. And one other thing is sometimes if there's specific wildlife issues in a particular area, like for instance, raptor nesting is very robust in the Lumpy Ridge area in particular. We can do closure areas during certain times of year when that's happening. And we work really closely with partners in the climbing world and places like Access Fund, organizations like Access Fund that really help us get the word out about some of those closure areas in specific times of year. But when you just think about general migration and congestion and crowding, that's certainly a concern at Rocky Mountain National Park.
Okie doke. Thank you so much, Kyle. And thank you to all of the presenters and panelists today for your brain power and your thoughts. And really most thankful to folks who stayed with us for this meeting. There are a bunch of people on the line, which is so exciting to me to see this many people logging in, spending time on your Thursday evening with us to learn more about this process and where we're at and where we're going. I did want to give a reminder to folks that we are in an active comment period if we haven't mentioned that already. We do genuinely want to hear from you. The comment period is going to stay open through the beginning part of February. Again, we really value and appreciate the time and effort that y'all put into putting your comment letters together, putting all that thoughtful correspondence together and sending it to us. We do have a team of people, real people who you've heard from tonight, who will go through those letters and read them. And so the time that you put into putting that letter together, we put into taking that letter in, analyzing it, and thinking about how to incorporate that into our process. All good ideas are incorporated into our process. Every letter gets actually read. So really appreciate the time that you're going to put into sharing your thoughts with us and seeing those come through on the other side. It is one of the joys of my job is reading that, and I mean that genuinely, of interacting with that correspondence. So thanks in advance for your letters. We really appreciate it. Encourage folks to continue to check out the information on the story map. And with that, I will turn it over to Darla for closing thoughts on the night.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Rachel. You were freezing there. So let me know if I freeze. Thanks, y'all, for continuing to to hang on here to the very end, going over a little bit here. Rachel did a great job just reiterating how important it is that we get y'all's thoughts and comments. You know, this stage has been a long time in coming, and so those of us here at the park are really excited that we're finally to this stage, because we have been working on it really since 2017. And these pilots and these experiments we've done over the past few years are just ways for us to experiment about what might work. But we really need this very thoughtful process with the public engaged, giving us ideas, giving us your thoughts, being really mindful about the end goal here, right? And that is to ensure that we're protecting the resources of Rocky Mountain National Park for future generations and giving people a great experience. So that is really what it's all about. This is an amazing, inspirational place. And those of us who have worked here for many years are just really, you know, inspired by it on a daily basis. And we know that our visitors feel the same way. And we want to continue to be open and accessible for everyone. And we just need to find the best way to do it. So we appreciate all of your ideas, all of your thoughtful information. And we love the park as much as anyone else out there does. But again, it's an international resource. And so we invite people from all over the United States, the world, to come and experience this place and be inspired by it. So thanks y'all for your time tonight. We greatly appreciate it, and we look forward to being in touch with you again soon. Good night, y'all. Take care. Happy holidays.